Hi, and welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. I'm your host, Cory Johnston, and today I'm joined by author of The End of Policing, Alex Vitale. Is that right?
Yeah, that's good. That works.
Close, eh? I'm bad for names, so. um, so I guess one of the first things I wanted to ask you about was a little bit of your background. And what got you into studying policing?
Yeah, it was definitely a kind of accidental process. That was not what I thought I was going to be doing with myself. I went to college, to study cultural anthropology and urban studies.
Okay.
And I was really interested in, urban development questions, and was looking at community-based housing organizations and economic development strategies, and the rise of black mayors in the 1970s, and these kinds of questions. And when I finished school, I went to work in California on housing and homelessness questions, which was
Okay.
really something I was very interested in. This is the beginnings of mass homelessness. This is the late 1980s, early 90s.
Right.
So I'm doing that work, developing housing policies for very low income people and things like that. But this is the period where we begin to see the ramping up of the criminalization of homelessness.
Right.
And so a lot of the folks that we were dealing with, who were homeless, formerly homeless, insecurely housed, were just complaining of constant police harassment. And my boss at the time, Paul Bowden, at the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness, asked me to look into this more and to take over working on civil rights issues as part of my portfolio. And what I figured out at that point was this sort of deeper truth, I think, that what was happening was that San Francisco, like a lot of cities, had given up on solving homelessness, and instead had turned the problem over to the police to put a lid on,
Okay.
to manage, not to solve, right? They can't solve homelessness, but they can reduce the impact on it so that city governments can continue to do their downtown redevelopment schemes and
Yeah.
subsidizing Wall Street and this kind of stuff. And then I moved to New York in 93, right as Giuliani gets elected. The same thing is happening here. And little by little, I get pushed into thinking more deeply about this connection between the criminal legal system and more traditional areas of urban development. And these two had been really separate issues. And a lot of my work, including my earlier book, City of Disorder, is about trying to bring these things together, see how they're connected.
Yeah. I suppose I live in Saskatchewan. So in our city of Regina, this was back in early 2000s, I think, we had a situation where there were some homeless people, and the businesses downtown were really complaining a lot to the city. So then they had the police come in, and they would move them on and shuffle them into the alleys, and then so you can't see the homelessness anymore, but it still exists.
Yeah, this is a huge issue in places like Vancouver and Victoria, and now increasingly across Canada, from what I understand. And yeah, they're not solving homelessness; they're just managing it.
And badly.
Well, right, in a way that fills the jails with homeless people, makes the lives of homeless people less secure, more disordered, and doesn't and it sucks up all the money. Police, we can't use police budgets to solve homelessness. We're going to need national level interventions, but
Right.
we could put a lot more money into housing first initiatives if we weren't spending half of local budgets on policing and jails.
Uh, just out of curiosity, how do you identify politically? Are you a lefty type, or are you more centrist liberal, or?
Well, I'm pretty illiberal. My first book, like I said, City of Disorder, was really a deep critique of urban liberalism.
Okay.
So and this second book is also a critique of liberalism.
Yeah, that is something that I noticed in, like, you often mention liberals in the way you're discussing things. It's all like, I often spend a lot of time arguing against conservatives, but and I try to be allies with liberals a little bit because they're the ones that have so much more power. But yeah, it seems like if they don't do something, then if they don't change their attitudes about various subjects, then nothing can change.
In this area particularly, right? I mean, liberals have been at the core of a strategy to implement austerity.
Right. Yeah.
Free up market, right? They're invested in neoliberalism as much as the right is.
Yeah.
So our big city mayors, for instance, have turned local economies over to finance and a few corporate headquarters and Amazon in a way that has produced more economic polarity, right? The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and it's out of those economic decisions that we get mass homelessness, that we get untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, that we get more black market activity, and then they turn those problems over to police.
Right.
And then when we complain that the policing is having a negative impact, they say, oh, well, we'll give them implicit bias training.
Right.
Right. Instead of saying, oh, maybe we shouldn't use police to manage the homeless problem. Maybe we should try to start housing people.
Right. Yeah. So I guess part of the issue with policing isn't necessarily the police themselves, although that might be part of it, but it's also the system that leads to how much they're working with.
Yeah, I often say this book is really more about political accountability than it is police accountability.
Right.
Because police did not defund the mental health system. Police did not create the war on drugs. Police did not defund public education. These were political decisions that then get dropped into the lap of police to manage. And there are a lot of police who understand this, who don't want to be in charge of every problem under the sun, who see how that produces all kinds of problems for them, but it's not up to them. So to think that we're going to solve all the problems of policing by going to a police commission meeting, right, misunderstands the level of the problem. And I think one of the things that's exciting about the kind of shift we've seen this year towards this so-called defund orientation is that it's shifting the analysis from policing to politics.
Right.
It's shifting the focus on a police commissioner to members of a city council or the mayor. And I think this is really important.
Yeah, what do you think of, there's a lot of discourse around the defund the police slogan or idea. So where do you land on the defund versus police abolition versus like some kind of reformation?
I've been involved in this work for a number of years, and defund the police wasn't a phrase that I used normally, and it wasn't a phrase that I heard in use around the country. And I was in a couple of dozen cities a year for several years before this summer, talking to activists on the ground. So I don't have any investment in that 3-word phrase.
Right.
What was important about it to me was what I mentioned before, it's changing the focus of attack from police to politicians, but it's also an explicit rejection of police reform.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that, well, if we just gave them more implicit bias training and body cameras, that would fix policing, restore trust in police, and then police could get back to the criminalization of poverty without so much complaining. Right. So it's an explicit rejection of that. The problem is that it leaves out half the equation, right? It gets the defund the police part right, but then it doesn't talk about, well, it's about shifting resources. It's about addressing austerity. It's about rebuilding communities or building them up in the first place. Some of them were never built up, right? And so defund the police fails to capture that kind of invest in community side of the equation, which kind of wouldn't fit on a cardboard protest sign or a
Yeah,
Twitter
I suppose.
hashtag.
Yeah. I that is often I converse with conservatives quite a bit, and there's lots of liberals around too. And when they argue against defund the police, they often have that question like, well, what do we do then? And
Yeah.
and I'm
Well,
always
see,
trying to, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
no, just they want to give you this kind of false choice. They want to say, well, if we're defunding the police, then we got nothing.
Right.
And of course, no one who's actually doing this work on the ground, talking to people, organizing, is saying that. First of all, it's not possible, right? There's no city council that's going to zero out the police budget because we said defund the police.
Right.
That there's no risk of that happening, right? So we have this massive policing apparatus, and what people are talking about is let's start dialing it back and replacing it with better alternatives. And when you have a chance to explain that to people, turns out that idea is pretty popular.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
we just need to talk about the details.
It's almost like the people who say the police are already doing too much. They are on this. They have the right idea in a sense.
Yeah, the police are doing too much, and I think part of the challenge, right, is that people have been told for so long that the only tool they can have to address their community problems is policing, that it's hard for them to imagine what else they would get. And in part, they've been told they can't have anything else.
Right.
So one of the challenges for the movement is to liberate the possibility that you could actually ask for what you want, but also to share knowledge with people about what might they ask for, right? So that just because you know that policing is a problem or you experience policing as a problem, and just because you're aware of like violence or disorder in the community, doesn't mean you know what they're doing in Portugal around drugs, or what they're doing in Los Angeles around peer-to-peer mental health counseling, right? So there needs to be a dialogue between what the community knows about its conditions and what the possibilities might be if they really had the power to ask for what they wanted.
Yeah, I suppose in the book you break it down into different sectors, like housing and drugs and sex work. I wonder, it almost seems like to defund the police properly, like you say, you have to rethink all of the structures we have in almost all aspects of society.
It's a big ask, right? It's a radical ask. Not because it's not possible or it's utopian, but because our political systems, across the North Atlantic, right, are so embedded in this neoliberal austerity politics. And ultimately, my argument is that we can't fix policing without addressing neoliberal austerity. That these two things are intertwined, and that's this connection, right, between urban public policy on the one hand and criminal justice policy on the other hand. Is these two things are organically interlinked. So even if we're leftists who want to start with primarily a class analysis and we want to talk about workplace organizing and these things, we cannot draw a conclusion that says, therefore, we don't need to worry about the criminal justice system. We'll fix that after we have power. That's
Right.
a mistake, right? Because part of what's propping up this system is the criminal legal system. And of course, for a lot of very poor people, the way they experience the oppression of this economic system is not in the workplace, because they're not in formal workplaces. The way they experience this is through the repression of policing.
Right.
So we're going to build solidarity across race lines with poor people's movements, right? We have to have the criminal justice system as a central feature of our analysis, not the only feature. I'm all for talking about workplace organizing. I'm a longtime unionist, and my family going back generations. So I that's terribly important, and maybe even more important. But to ignore these criminal justice questions is going to undermine the kind of work that needs to be done, I think.
You mentioned in your book that, like, you talk about like broken windows policing, and I wonder, is that where some of this idea that police are the answer to society's ills comes from?
Yeah, the broken windows theory, which is developed in the early 80s but remains kind of nascent. It doesn't really emerge as a movement until the late 80s and early 90s.
Okay.
In conjunction with this neoconservative turn in urban governance. So no one really paid much attention to it initially, but then it became a tool that would serve a political function. And it was to facilitate this conservative retrenchment of local government, to justify turning homelessness into a policing problem, turning drug addiction into a policing problem, to turn mental health into a policing problem. The broken windows theory says that the problems of urban America are not structural disinvestment, deindustrialization, austerity. No, it's too much individual freedom, moral deregulation that is producing chaos that we can fix by using the police to micromanage the behavior of poor people. So this is perfect because it absolves government and markets of any responsibility for the social problems of society and blames it all on the immorality of poor people, mostly non-white in this equation. And then it empowers this massive expansion of the scope and intensity of policing.
It makes me, like, a couple of the phrases you use there, like the individual, there's too much individual freedom, but also like that seems like a kind of thing that the current right would use as like a talking point. Like they believe in individual freedom.
Not for black and brown people.
Right, that's true. Yeah.
See, that's the problem here, right? Is that it's always racialized, right? And these urban neoconservatives, right? They want freedom for markets, but they don't want freedom of interpersonal behavior. And this whole thing is driven by a reaction to the successes of the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s. It's a reaction against the civil rights movement and the demands for, equality of spending and opportunity and integration. It's a reaction against the gay rights movement, against the women's movement, right? It's about shutting down these public spaces. It's about a retrenchment, a restoration of a conservative public sphere, right? So they're using policing to put these movements back in the bottle.
Okay. Yeah. It's
they even say things like, well, disorder includes things like interracial couples walking down the street together because it offends the sensibilities of, good upstate people.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's yeah. That's pretty brutal, actually. It's so I guess we kind of talked about it a little bit here already, but what are some ways that policing is doing more harm, I guess? Like, I guess that's kind of a lot of the book, right?
So what I do in the book is I look at a bunch of specific things that police do, and I look at the history of how they got into doing them, the harms that it causes, and then I talk ultimately about what we could really do instead of using police. So in some cases, we need these alternatives so that we can reduce our reliance on policing. In other areas, policing is just inherently harmful and a bad idea, right? So, using police for all kinds of vice enforcement including drugs. It's just a terrible idea. And if we just eliminated those police functions, we'd be better off as a society. We would want to also invest in better drug treatment services, harm reduction initiatives, economic development things as well. But, the creation of police imposed black markets for things like drugs and sex work and gambling just empowers organized criminality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, one of the reasons we have communities that are filled with guns in the United States is because we've created these black markets in drugs and those black markets use violence to resolve disputes. They have money. So they're actually the ones often responsible for the huge influx of guns into the community.
Right.
If we didn't have these illegal drug markets, we might not have so many guns in circulation that then get used in domestic disputes and interpersonal violence of various kinds. So that's just like one example. And of course, the overdose crisis is the result of criminalization of drugs. And we need to look at decriminalization and legalization strategies.
One of the things that really caught me with the book was the section on mental health and mental illness being policed, and how, even like you said, like I think it was a commissioner or somebody knew that if they fought to keep open a institution, because if it closed, then they knew that it would increase the arrests and the trouble in the streets.
Yeah, I think I just got off a call with city officials across Canada discussing this exact issue, right? Which is, we've defunded mental health services, and then we've dumped that burden onto police because there's no one else to respond, and it produces really bad outcomes: violence, arrests, forced hospitalizations, none of which are really good. And cities are beginning to try to figure out how to get out from under this. And so they're looking at the creation of both alternative crisis response teams, but also to begin to develop better community-based mental health services so people don't have a crisis in the first place.
Right.
And in the States, between 1.25% of all people killed by police are having a mental health crisis.
That's quite high. That's wild.
It's someone every day in the United States is killed under those circumstances.
Because having a mental health crisis. That's wild. Like, I suppose there's a lot of services necessary in that aspect as well. Like, you're going to have a lot of undiagnosed people also having mental health crises, but because they're undiagnosed, then nobody knows it until it's way too late.
Yeah, one of the challenges in the Canadian context is that, policing is like a local expense, but medical services are under the control of the provinces.
Right.
So we got to not just fix the local politics, we got to fix the province level politics, because the local governments can't start creating, mental health clinics. But there are some things that municipalities could do, I think, even with those restrictions, which is they could look at things like non-clinical peer-to-peer interventions. Which we're seeing some experiment. We've had stuff like that in Europe for a while. We're seeing some experimentation in the States and places like LA County, where they're opening up these drop-in centers that are staffed by people who have experienced mental health problems themselves, and they can give advice, guidance, and referrals to people. Provide maybe respite beds that are voluntary. You need a change of venue, someone to keep an eye on you. Maybe you're feeling suicidal. Maybe you're feeling depressed or super aggressive. So come and hang out here. We'll keep an eye on you and we can talk to you. Are you thinking about medication? Okay, here's who you would talk to. Here's what you can expect. What about talk therapy? What about family supports, right? It turns out that can resolve a huge amount of stuff that otherwise spirals out of control until the police get involved, and then someone ends up getting shot or forcibly hospitalized or sent to jail or something like that.
Right. So I guess that's mental health issues. There's one problem. What about what is the school to prison pipeline?
Right. Well, so in the States, we've had this a couple of generations now of education reform, which is basically about the privatization, neoliberalization of public education, charter schools, high stakes testing, and all this stuff. And this has produced a failed educational environment where education is degraded to just becoming teaching to the test. And then students who are failed by that system and act out are criminalized. They're suspended, they're expelled, and they're turned over to school police. And so what's happening is that young people their futures are being defunded to pay for more policing to drive them into the criminal justice system for misbehavior in schools. It's heavily racialized, right? The burden of this falls disproportionately on Black and brown youth. And the group that's most heavily affected by this are young people with disabilities.
Yeah. I was listening to something recently, I think it was from Vice, and they were talking about this push to have armed teachers in the schools as well.
Yeah.
And there's like so many schools in Florida that have armed teachers that you don't even know are armed because they have to be secret, because there's a cultural belief that any student could at any time become a danger to the rest of them.
Yeah, well, this is the kind of right-wing neoconservative view, right? We're privatizing education, and now we're privatizing security. So you have all these right to carry states and this encouraging of private gun carrying. Well, what we know is that when we introduce a lot of guns into an environment, they're not used to get bad guys.
Right.
They're used for suicides. They're used in domestic disputes. They're used in they are a source of accidental shootings. So, and this is what's happened in schools. Students have been shot accidentally.
Right.
And there was a case of someone was doing firearms training, a teacher, an armed teacher, right, and discharges the weapon into the ceiling. The bullet fragments, and a student is injured.
Jeez, yeah. It seems so obviously bad.
Well, it's ideological, right? It's not driven by any kind of empirical research or common sense. It's part of this idea of government is the problem. We're going to privatize it. It's going to be a war of all against all, and there'll be this deterrent effect somehow. But really, people are shooting each other.
Right.
It's just increasing the violence. And this is it's a political crisis. It's a social and political crisis.
Speaking of ideology, not to play the devil's advocate, but I'm sure there are people who would say that we are coming at this from an ideological perspective. So I wonder what your defense is against that.
Right. So when we look at this question of addressing public safety challenges, we should think broadly about, well, what are the potential tools available to us, and what does the evidence suggest might be the best strategy? Well, when we do that, it turns out policing doesn't fare very well, right? That when we sit down with people and say, look, we got a drug problem in our community. What if we just put everything on the table and came up with a holistic plan for addressing the drug problem? And we bring in some experts and some people who were directly affected by this dynamic, And it turns out that when we do that, people are like, oh, we need drug treatment, we need harm reduction services, we need youth counseling, we need targeted economic development programs. And that's what the research shows is effective. And
Right.
we have an example of this in Ithaca, New York, that they did this. The mayor there's like, we got to try something different, and went to the community. There were town halls and focus groups, and they came up with the Ithaca plan, and there's no police in it.
Hmm.
This idea that we need police is driven by a bunch of moralizing and deeply conservative political ideologies. There's no research to support it. The police never have to prove that what they do actually works. It's just
Right.
accepted.
Yeah.
But for us, we have to give them 27 peer-reviewed studies before we can even try an experiment.
Yeah. No, that's right. One of the things that I guess we talk about is like the propaganda thing, like the cultural belief that policing works, and that sometimes they don't even have to follow the rules, because if they follow the rules all the time, then they won't be doing their job good.
The media, the entertainment media as well as the news media, are a major driver of this problem. One of the most surprising victories this summer was the canceling of these live police shows, Cops and Live PD, because they're, I think, incredibly toxic to they produce racism, and they produce this ideology that police are the only possible tool for everything, and that police can do no wrong, et cetera. So that was a big victory. But still, every police show produces this fantasy world. It imagines that what police do all day is chase bank robbers and serial killers, and that they actually find these people, and that this is what counts as justice, and that this makes us safer.
Right.
And this just has nothing to do with reality. We're not finding serial killers based on some paint chip. Police are not spending their time chasing bank robbers. They're chasing homeless people. They're driving kids off street corners. They're doing, bullshit low-level drug enforcement. They're engaged in racial profiling. They're, shooting mentally ill people in crisis. This is what policing really is.
Yeah, even a lot of the stuff that people see, like they believe that there's like all this science behind forensics, and even that is like it's so much pseudoscience in that.
It's interesting. It's created a problem for them. It's called the CSI effect, which is now when jurors are looking at a trial, they want to see all this perfect science, all this scientific proof, which is all fantasy. It doesn't really exist. And now it's producing a problem for prosecutors, because they've created this fake expectation that there's going to be its perfect scientific proof, which is not how this really works. The CSI problem, right, is that it imagines that we find some little piece of trace evidence that's going to lead us to some otherwise unsuspected person.
Right.
This almost never happens. What happens is we have someone in custody who we are convinced did it, and we need some additional evidence to be able to pass muster in court.
Right.
It's very rare. Every once in a while, we find someone's DNA, and their DNA is in the database, and that connects it. That happens occasionally. It's very rare, and the vast majority of this is the other way around. They already know who did it. They just need some physical evidence to prove it.
Right. Yeah, like I guess, where do prosecutors play a role in all of this?
Well, if you're talking about things like mass incarceration, it's huge, right? So Jonathan Pfaff, the law professor at Fordham University, wrote a book that showed that one of the main explanations for the rise in incarceration rates in the states was discretionary decision-making at the local prosecution level. So local elected DAs were increasing the charges and asking for higher sentences. And that this is what really explains the number of people and the length of time they're spending in prison. Now, of course, that's a reflection of this larger political environment of turning
Right.
our problems over to the criminal legal system. But it's not like, oh, the 94 crime bill that Bill Clinton signed and that Joe Biden helped write somehow created all this mess. That was part of this huge national trend, and prosecutors have played a huge role. And that's what's driven this so-called progressive prosecutor movement in the States, where we're seeing a lot of better prosecutors getting elected. Some of them are quite transformative, like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia or Rachel Rollins in the Boston area. Some of these folks are really great. Some are kind of so-so, not really making the impact that we need.
We're coming up here. It's 35 minutes. I want to ask you one more question before we kind of get it into the where can people find you stuff. But what are your thoughts on this recent thing with the Capitol?
Right. So I did an interview with the National Public Radio's Code Switch program the other day and had a chance to lay some of this out, so people can look that up. But I think it's a mistake, right, to make this a conversation primarily about policing, or to say this was about, oh, the Capitol Police let them in because they're in league with the demonstrators. Obviously, there are a lot of really problematic sympathies between police
Right.
and these right-wing movements. I mean, the head of the Sergeants Union here has a QAnon cup on his bookcase when he does interviews. I mean,
That's
these
concerning.
people, a lot of them are Trumpists. Their unions endorse Trump. But if we look closely at the videos that day, and just the evidence, we see that there were pitched battles, that a police officer was killed, 60 police were injured, some quite seriously, and that the people attacking the Capitol were using very high levels of violence to get in there. So maybe one or two officers, did something inappropriate. Maybe that's true, but that's not the explanation. The explanation is political. You got the president and members of Congress who are enabling and promoting these movements for their own political purposes.
Yeah.
And that's who's responsible. I mean, okay, so you arrest the participants in the violence and the ransacking of some offices, fine. That's not going to fix this problem. What's going to fix this problem is getting rid of Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and all these right-wing extremists who are officials in our government. And we got to keep the eyes focused on where the real power is.
Right. Yeah.
In this, not a few wingnuts with buffalo horn costumes on.
One of the things that I think it was Joe Biden said something about we're going to crack down and we're going to do something so that this can't happen again. And my concern is that these things never get handled evenly, right? Like it's always going to be Black Lives Matter that suffers the consequences of laws they put in place because of what happened at the Capitol.
Yeah, it is a big mistake for anyone on the left to be talking about creating new domestic terrorism laws or ramping up the capacities of the FBI, because that is invariably going to be turned against left movements, against Black Lives Matter, against, democratic socialist movements, whatever, because that's the historical nature of political policing. It has always been a tool of suppressing the left, not of suppressing the right.
Yeah.
So this whole rhetoric is a way of politicians absolving themselves of any responsibility for this.
Right.
It's the same problem. We're taking a political problem, whether it's homelessness or mental health or failed schools that they created, and then saying, oh no, this is about policing and moral irresponsibility. No, this is your mess. And you should be held accountable for it. And we should not fall into this trap of thinking that if we throw a couple of Capitol police officers under the bus, that then justice has been done.
Right, right. One of the things that I did notice actually in your book too was that a lot of like you talk about how the disproportionate use of policing against leftist movements, and you mention anarchists quite a bit, which I appreciated.
I mean, I come out of a kind of anti-authoritarian politics. So I'm very sympathetic to that. I was involved in anti-nuclear movements and groups like Food Not Bombs that
Right.
come out of that tradition. But I struggled in the book because, we're going to need a state to solve some of these problems, I think. So whether it's like the environmental crisis,
it's the organization on the mass scale.
In communities, we should do that. To the extent that we can do these things outside of a state-centered framework, I'm for that. But I think that we need to talk about the role of the state here. And so I've tried to sort of split the difference on that.
That's fair. The state exists already. So
Right. That's right. So as we rework the responsibilities of the state from a position of care, not coercion, then we can look at ways to reduce the scope of the state, to replace it with mutual aid and cooperative systems, et cetera. Totally sympathetic to that.
Right on. Okay. So where can people find you on the internet?
Everywhere. Right now. I'm on Twitter at @avitale. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. So I'm easy to find. And the book is available direct from Verso Books, heavily discounted ebook. So easy to check it out.
And if you don't have enough time to do a reading, then it's audiobook.
Yes, there's an audiobook, and I think a bunch of the chapters have been read on to YouTube pages. So
probably,
you can find that if you really want it.
Right on. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.
You bet, Cory.
That's all, folks. Thanks for listening. Remember to share this show with your friends and on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. Every dollar I get makes it so that I can spend more time working on this show and the other shows I'm involved in to bring you high quality content. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can send me money on PayPal at paypal.me/brainstormpodcast. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on your podcast app of choice or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out my Linktree at linktree/skepticalcory. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other shows, which include Skeptarchy, which is a panel show that I do with some very smart people, From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics, and The Feminist Family, which I do with my partner. My Twitter is @HardcoreSkeptic, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, or you can send me a friend request at facebook.com/CJBrainstorm. I accept most friend requests. Thanks for listening, and have a good one.